Ļoti cienījamā Latvijas Universitātes prorektore Ina Druvietes kundze, sehr geehrte Ehrendoktoren der Universität Lettlands, cienījamie kolēģi un visi klātesošie. Šodien mūsu divi pasākumi, ko organizē Pedagoģijas, Psiholoģijas un Mākslas fakultāte, ir veltīti Latvijas Universitātes kārtējai jubilejai, 96. dzimšanas dienai. Vispirms mēs klausīsimies jaunā Goda doktora lekciju, pēc tam, pēc starpbrīža, atvērsim mūsu sērijas, mums visiem tik labi pazīstamās, laikmets un personība, noslēdzošo 15. krājumu. Un pasākuma sākumā dodu vārdu Latvijas Universitātes prorektorei Inai Druvietei.
Mīļie Latvijas Universitātes kolēģi, dear friends, dear colleagues, it's really a great honor and pleasure for me to meet you at the anniversary of Latvia's University at a very nice day and at the opening of the book, which would mean again new contribution to the educational sciences, to pedagogy in Latvia. So it's a very great day indeed. What does it mean to be honorary doctor? And it's not a coincidence that we have even 4 honorary doctors working in pedagogy dealing with educational sciences. It means to be a friend, to be a colleague, to be a supporter. And we are very honored that today 3 of you and later all 4 of you are present. University of Latvia is entering a new stage of development. I hope so. We have new rector, we have new team, and we are ready to do our best in order to make our university, our country even more successful, even more flourishing. For me, it's a very special day because Marka Depāpes is giving his academic lecture. For me, you are not only one of our honorary doctors, but for me, you are and were my host at the University of Leuven at Kortrijk. Yes, I was lucky enough to give academic lecture at that university October last year, and I really admired your contribution to the development of your university, your friendship, your support. And later at home, I read the book you gave to me, and I was very surprised how you could join together this philosophical approach, modern technologies, advanced thinking, and understanding how our world works. Later, I wrote one article for our agency of the Latvian language about bilingual education, and then out of hundreds of very valuable thoughts and ideas, I chose one quotation, and it was about perception of system of education. What does it mean to work at school? What does it mean to work at university? And your idea that the system of education is and must be responsible on everything, that we have to cooperate with parents, with government, with university, it's a very valuable thought indeed. So I really look forward to very nice presentation of the new book, to very inspiring lecture, and again again, I'm very thankful to the Faculty of Pedagogy, Arts and Psychology, to professors who brought our wonderful honorary doctors here, and for your presence, which would help us to be more successful in our future work. Thank you very much.
Augsti godātie prorektori, profesori Marka Depāpe, profesori Druviete, augsti godātie Goda doktori, profesori, kolēģi, viesi. Es patiešām ar ļoti lielu lepnumu, gandarījumu un prieku stādu jums šodien priekšā mūsu jauno Goda doktoru, Lēvenes Universitātes profesoru Marku Depāpi. Viņš ir pedagoģijas zinātņu habilitētais doktors, Lēvenes Universitātes prorektors, Kortrīkas filiāles rektors, Starptautiskās izglītības akadēmijas biedrs un direktoru padomes loceklis. Mūsu sadarbība ar Marku Depāpi aizsākās 2003. gadā. Šo gadu laikā profesors ir ieguldījis savu laiku un zināšanas pedagoģijas zinātnes attīstībā Latvijas Universitātē un Latvijas zinātnieku starptautiskajā atpazīstamībā. Daudzveidīgs un plašs ir profesora Depāpes starptautiskās sadarbības lauks. Viņš darbojas universitāšu zinātniskajās padomēs Vācijā, Itālijā un Ungārijā. Ir bijis viesprofesors Parīzes, Londonas, Minhenes un Medisonas augstskolās, kā arī lasījis vieslekcijas 24 pasaules augstskolās. Tā skaitā Cīrikē, Bankokā, Berlīnē, Bernē, Johannesburgā, Keiptaunā un tā tālāk un tā joprojām. Profesors Marks Depāpe ir darbojies un darbojas redkolēģijās 12 zinātniskajos žurnālos un izdevumos, kuri tiek izdoti ASV, Austrālijā, Beļģijā, Itālijā, Šveicē, Spānijā, Vācijā un citur. Kā arī ir starptautiskā izdevuma Pedagogika Historika līdzredaktors. Viņš ir vairāku prestižu starptautisko profesionālo organizāciju biedrs un bijis šī prezidents. Profesors Marks Depāpe ir pētījis pedagoģijas vēstures teoriju un metodoloģiju un devis savu ieguldījumu pedagoģijas un psiholoģijas zinātņu attīstībā, izglītības un skolotāju profesijas vēsturē. Viņš ir apmēram 600 publikāciju autors, tā skaitā 27 grāmatu autors vai līdzautors, 22 grāmatu redaktors un sastādītājs, un viņa darbi ir tulkoti 17 pasaules valodās, tā skaitā latviešu. Savu bagāto starptautisko pieredzi profesors Marks Depāpe ir nesautīgi dalījis ar Latvijas Universitātes studentiem un mācībspēkiem. Viņš bija viens no šī rīkotājiem 2013. gadā Rīgā Latvijas Universitātē. Šī konference, kas pulcēja dalībniekus no 133 pasaules universitātēm, bija nozīmīgs notikums LU zinātniskā potenciāla popularizēšanā. Kā cienītam zinātniekam un administratoram, profesoram Markam Depāpem ir plašas iespējas organizēt Latvijas Universitātes profesoru un doktoru viesošanos Beļģijā. Ar viņa atbalstu mūsu mācībspēki un doktoranti ir piedalījušies prestīžajā pasaules pētnieku apvienību konferencē, kas pulcēja filozofijas un izglītības vēstures profesorus galvenokārt no Amerikas, Lielbritānijas un Vācijas. Mūsu profesori ir stažējušies un lasījuši vieslekcijas Lēvenes Universitātē, un profesors Marks Depāpe ir bijis iniciators kontaktiem ar citiem Beļģijas zinātniekiem, kas recenzējuši un konsultējuši Latvijas Universitātes doktorantu promocijas darbu. Regulāri sazinoties un sadarbojoties ar Latvijas Universitātes profesoriem un doktorantiem, Marks Depāpe ir devis nozīmīgu ieguldījumu pedagoģijas vēstures attīstībā Latvijā jaunā zinātniskā kvalitātē, it īpaši pētniecības metodoloģijas jomā. Par nozīmīgu ieguldījumu pedagoģijas zinātnes attīstībā Latvijas universitātē un Latvijas universitātes zinātniskā potenciāla popularizēšanu pasaulē profesoram Markam Depāpem 2015. Gadā tika piešķirts Latvijas universitātes Goda doktora grāds. Paldies par uzmanību. Profesor Depāpe, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for all these kind words. For me, I think they are exaggerated, but as a historian of education, I have worked in the field of demythologizing and demystification. So I have to demythologize myself, but time is running and I have prepared more than 40 slides, so I will go a little bit quick, if you don't mind. An honorary doctorate for a historian of education, of course, personally I feel very honored, but I think the most important is that it is an honor for a modest field of research, and it is not only an honor for myself, but I think most of my colleagues and collaborators with whom I have published a lot in the foregoing years. All this you have said about me is, of course, teamwork, and I did a lot to, in trying to give that idea that history is not necessarily, and history of education in particularly, not necessarily individual work, but can be teamwork as well. Okay, let me start by saying something about the history of education itself. I think this is, if you want to write the history of education, that you will find a paradoxical history, in the sense that in the 19th century, history of education, or history of pedagogy as it was called, and I think it is even called like that here in Latvia, was the nucleus, was the center of all pedagogical thought and pedagogical science. Because one had high expectations, it started in France and so on, but I will not go into detail, in view of the construction of national school systems. Through history, one wanted to come to identity finding, identity building, but also the professional ethical codes of scholarship. I think this was not only in Europe the case, this was also the case in America, in Northern America, but also in Eastern Europe. What we have witnessed in the past decades is a little bit the opposite. History of education became more and more history. It underwent, and I think that was necessary, a kind of historicization instead of educationalization, and that was a sobering effect for the pedagogues, because history was considered as irrelevant for pedagogues. But I think there is still a great relevance of the irrelevant. History is all about interpretation. It is only by history, by taking a step from the present, that you can see, I think, what is going on. We will need in the future much more than today, where it is full of evidence-based research and empirical research, and that's good. But I think you have to take from time to time a step outside from this evidence-based and empirical research. So there will be a need, I think, in future for meta-reflections, for philosophy, for history, for culture, for art. And what is very surprising to me, but on the other hand also I like it very much, is that your faculty is a faculty of pedagogy, psychology, but also of art, because I think art is something like history. You have to take a step from the outside of what's going on to see what's going on inside. Even within the context of neoliberalism and market-oriented evidence-based empirical research, this will be more than necessary in future. So things are much more complex than thinking in terms of these old dichotomies, and I will come back to that in my lecture, old and new and something like that. The complexity of the reality is, or the reality is much more complex than that kind of simple dichotomies. It's full of ambiguities, complexities, and these ambiguities and complexities can be found, I think, by doing historical research. But paradoxical is also that history of education may be in the margin today of teacher colleges and things like that. It's certainly not anymore in the nucleus. But on the other hand, if you look at the research that is done today, not necessarily by historians of education, but also by other people that are concentrating on the history of education, it is really flourishing. And it is a little bit irony. I like paradoxes, I like ironies. In the 1920s and 30s in the United States, one author said, "Lo, the poor history of education." And in the 1960s he said, "Hail the flourishing history of education." What happened in the United States was revisionism. I think we need that kind of revisionism from day to day, and we have got in the history of education some paradigmatic developments. Nowadays, we speak about post-revisionism and about the cultural history of education. And there is an enormous literature underpinning that. There are flourishing journals. Iveta already mentioned Pedagogica Historica, for which I have done a lot, but also I think it's a very important organization is the ISHE, which was also mentioned, the International Standing Conference for the History of Education, and we were very proud to have had here in Riga in 1913. That must be 2013, of course, this big international conference. You see, historians are not very good in dates. But it's not always very sunny and sunshine, even in the history of education, as I try to explain. And we have, for instance, I think, complex relationships with education museums. In the 1960s and 70s, when history of education became more and more important from the field of cultural history and social history, there arose in Germany, but also elsewhere, a lot of education museums. And my idea, but I am only a humble historian, a simple scientist, was that these museums could be the laboratories for the history of education. But that was not so simple, because even in these museums you had the same paradigmatic tension between educationalizing on the one hand and historicizing on the other one. And these museums were much more, and I will give you an example, on the side of educationalizing. And they were, I think, the victim of an enduring educationalizing trap. They saw themselves as educational agents with normative messages for the public, and they wanted to be attractive to the public, to have as much as visitors as possible, and this led to elementarization, visualization, and things like that. And that was behind all this was the desire to keep it simple. Theoretical reflection, let alone methodological reflection about complexities and ambiguities of the educational past, was not the main issue of educational museums. One wanted to be relevant and to have a message. I will tell you something about Ypres, because Ypres has been also Ypres, if you want, in Flanders Field Museum. Everybody knows that, I suppose. In the picture those days with the remembrance of the Great War. So we have in Ypres Flanders Field Museum, which is remembering the Great War, and next to that we have the Educational Museum. Leading figures in politics, or of course in favor of the In Flanders Field Museum, big historians, or in favor of the Flanders Field Museum. Why? Because, of course, this whole remembrance story gives a market to touristical, economical advantage on the one hand, but also for the historians, it's a market to prove how important they are, what they have done, and so on and so on. So behind these discourses, you have social expectations, implicit and explicit, not the least touristic and commercial benefits. There is even in Ypres a war beer. You can buy war chocolates in Belgium. There are a lot of ideological interpretations also putting on the past, and that has to do with the cultural tensions between Flemish people and the Francophone regions over the remembrance zone and the Flemish nationalism and the collaboration or not collaboration in the war and so on. So commemoration, ladies and gentlemen, is a present-day activity. It is not something which belongs to history itself. It is something that we make today, and we have to be aware about it. These rhetorics of remembrance have a present-day function. Here you can see, I hope you can see it, this is the City Hall of Ypres. And this is the old Cloth Hall, which used to be built in the Middle Ages, which has been destroyed completely, almost completely destroyed by the Germans in the First World War, and has been rebuilt after the First World War. It has also a very symbolic meaning in Ypres. Well, our education museum at the time started in the left wing of this City Hall. But very early, we had to move, after 9 years, we had to move for the In Flanders Field Museum, which was built as a hyper-modern museum with unseen technical, in Belgium, really unseen technical possibilities. Everything is ICT, and you have, and so on. So the idea and the educationalizing message behind the In Flanders Field Museum is no more war, peace education, and this is in the same line with other monuments in Ypres, like the Menin Gate is the most important, where every night they play at 8 o'clock in the evening, the last post to remember the victims, the soldiers of the big war. To make sure, I have, of course, nothing against peace. On the contrary, I feel myself a very peaceful man, and I have nothing against commemorations. I was also impressed by the 30,000 lost posts under the Menin Gate, and there was, I think, a poem which speaks for itself. Who will remember passing through this gate the unheroic dead who fed the guns, who shall absolve the fullness of their fate, those doomed, conscripted, unvictorious ones. But this is, I think, another more emotional discourse or empathical discourse about the irrationality of war, and that may be a message, but lessons to teach, I don't think history has lessons to teach that much, because we did not learn that lessons, and it is always in the present that these lessons are embedded, and they say much more about the present than about the past. So let's go to the facts. And the fact is that, of course, this big museum, the In Flanders Field Museum, you see it on the right, and on the left you see the Education Museum, has a lot more visitors. So that makes that even today one speaks to close the Education Museum, because everything should be integrated in the great museum of the city of Ypres. And this is completely against our idea, and I think against the scientific idea to develop education museums as the material basis for the history of education. Not only in view of scientific basis for exhibitions, because I think you cannot make exhibitions in museums without any scientific basis, but also in the sense of workplaces for scientific development. It is nonsense that universities have to keep all these material artifacts of the past, because there is no place for that. And so I think we should develop museums much more than before as the really workplaces for development of scientific research. However, visitors were mainly, but not exclusively, you have seen in quantity, they were, of course, not comparable to the visitors of the In Flanders Field Museum, but also in quality. These people that visited the Education Museum were mainly pupils. That was the important target group, which explains, of course, the educationalizing movement. They developed in Ypres an educational pack, a museum box, as an appetizer for school trips, worksheets for visiting museums, for visitors of the museum, practical workshops, and things like that. So the discourse, like in pedagogy today, is you have to have a funny museum, and on the other hand, for the older people, you have to have a museum full of nostalgia. I think both of these ideas are not the way in which museums should be developed. They are opposite to the idea of a scientific basis. And a scientific basis, what I see in this museum, and I will explain that in the lecture, is a quasi-universal grammar of schooling. Wherever you go in the world, I have visited education museums in Australia and almost all countries that I have visited, and you see everywhere the same things: school desks, ink pots, and so on and so on. So let's talk about this, because I think, and that comes back to that also that empathical role, like they say in German, vorbei ist nicht vorüber. It seems to me like a missed opportunity also from the museological perspective. They missed in contributing to the individual processing of the educational past, even the liberating love or the perspective, including the aha-erlebnis. We had, for instance, history on sexuality, a thematic exhibition, and so on. Also on Africa, on our colonial past. I think you can gain wisdom and understanding from the historic role of schooling. That's about the grammar of schooling. Reflection in a museum starts with artifacts, with facts. But not in that sense. This is an amateuristic, and most of the education museums are, also in Germany, on that level, very sympathetic people, all teachers, former teachers, that are impressed mostly by nostalgia and so on, and that put everything together as a kind of folklore, and that's where Ypres ends when they close the museum. Thematically as well as chronologically, there is no scientific basis. and it is from the point of view of history of education from time to time nonsense. And I want to illustrate that with one artifact that everybody of you knows, namely the school desk. As I said, everywhere where you go to education museums, the school desk has a prominent role. It is a remarkable icon of collective memory of schooling. And you don't need to go far away for proving that. If I look at my library, I just choose some covers of educational historiographies that has nothing to do with the history of the school desk, but that represent the educational past. So in representing the educational past, to find a good cover for a book that is on the history of education, mostly they go back to a school desk. And even in the museums itself, when the museum in Ypres opened in 1990, you see on your left, I suppose, on your left you see all the Minister of Education is there, all important people are there, and they put themselves on the school desk to see we like schooling, we are in favor of the history of education. And it's not by accident that I found almost the analogous picture, of course, representing other people, in the Museum of Bergisch Gladbach in Germany. The Minister-President of North Rhine-Westphalia was there, and so on and so on. But in museums, do they pay attention to these artifacts? Of course, school desks are there, but as a reminiscent, as an artifact of a long past. But do they, for instance, pay attention to the biography of these objects? A school desk is something that has been invented, that has been produced, but that also had an afterlife. If I look on the internet, you can buy second-hand school desks, and you see from such a second-hand website a school desk which, due to its characteristics, has another another character than in his former period, because in the 19th century or in the beginning of the 20th century or even in the 1960s, you will not find a pink school desk in a classroom. So it has been repainted. That means it has another function also in the household or wherever it is, and I come back to that. So you can say that the school desk has got a life cycle. It was developed by designers, and I will come back to that. It had a public, it was sold, but when it is in a museum, it has another life. And it can have, even after the museum, an afterlife. Just to prove to you that all these scientific aspects of thinking about school desks are not reflected into our contemporary museums. So there is a long way to go. And we are not even aware of the fact that this school desk is representing our mentality, our mental structure about what a classroom is. We cannot even think about a new classroom, and we have got 100 years of so-called new education, but we are still not able to think about a schoolroom or a classroom of the future without a school desk. I found this on the internet, and you see, this is an Italian design for a new classroom in the 21st century. In the end of 2050 or whatever, and what you see, of course, it is a little bit colored, is a little bit ecologically done, but it is in fact, an ordinary classroom. It is ordered in the same architecture, inner architecture, than what we have got since the beginning of the 19th century, at least in Belgium. So why is it so impressive, this school desk, this material conception that is inside our mentality of schooling, of classroom, and so on? Well, I think this has to do with the impressive cult of order and discipline, which is embedded in our mentality if we think about education. You see, a comic, even it is about the normativity of Catholic, and it is so from the other side, it is from the liberals that attacked the normativity of Catholic education. But even in the figure you see, they are filling their heads with ideology of the children, but the children are put into school desks. And even what we have done, I did a lot of work on the cultural transfer from Belgium to the colony, to the Belgian Congo in the beginning of, from 1908 till 1960, in the first half of the 20th century. And what we have done, and I could give you films and things like that, is in fact we have transferred that idea of schooling, that idea of grammar of schooling, that idea of order into Congolese classrooms. And where does it comes from? Well, a key element in integrating and in the foundation of school desks, there is a historical relation with the desk in the church in the medieval time, but I will not go into that, is that desk was a key element in bringing structure, order, Cartesian order in the chaos and the chaos that was reigning in the educational behavior in the 17th, 18th centuries. You have famous paintings of classrooms in the Dutch school in the Netherlands from famous painters in the 17th century. You see an example. And what came was ordering class instruction with a teacher in front. In fact, what we are doing here is displaying that idea. You have to listen because the teacher knows it, and you have to undergo this choreography of schooling. Well, that was what came into place from the beginning in Belgium, at least, of the 19th century onwards. We did a book with teamwork. In history, it's one of the most important books I think we have written in Belgium, is Order in Progress. And there, because as I said, history is all about interpretation, we tried to find theoretical frameworks to understand and to explain what was going on in the history of schooling. And one of the most important theories that was behind our ideas, but that we tried to refine, I come back to that in a few moments, were the writings of people in the United States like Larry Cuban, William Tobin, David Tayak, and so on, all people from Stanford School of Education, who developed the idea of a grammar not in the linguistic sense, but a grammar in the sense that there are structures that are hard to change, and that these structures are governing, in fact, our classroom behavior. Kinds of persistent structures that makes innovation in education not necessarily impossible, but nevertheless very difficult. And one of the most important ideas is the one that is coming. It is not so much the innovation, the educational innovation that changes schooling, but the grammar of schooling that changes the educational innovation. So innovations can only be adopted to the level that they can be integrated in our old ideas conception of schooling. And that idea was, in fact, one of our inspiration sources for the book, but we tried to refine that because this was a relatively, but I will not go into detail, a relatively behavioristical theory. We wanted to give it more body, and I think Belgian scholars are good placed or well placed for doing that because they can read also the German literature on Pädagogisierung and its anthropological dimension, the Spanish literature on la historia de la arquitectura and so on, arqueología de la educación. The role of the new education is very crucial in that. In almost all countries of the Western Europe and also in the United States, you had from the last quarter of the 19th century a movement that was called Reformpädagogik in Germany, or New Education, La Nouvelle Education, la Scuola Nueva in Spain, and in United States, Progressive Education. Of course, this is not a unified reform movement, but this is a reform movement with several characteristics, and one essential characteristic, and therefore it was liked by the pedagogues, was to put the child in the center. Child-centered education instead of teacher-centered education, the so-called adagium vom Kinde aus. And in the traditional literature, which was based on the self-discourse of this new education movement, it was seen as very attractive, very positive, also for the child. And moreover, it was considered by people like Edouard Claparède from Geneva, like a Copernican revolution, eine kopernikanische Revolution. But in fact, it wasn't. What happened was, like Clary Cuban said, it was the gradual adaptation to modernization, that means to a modern school or to modern education, but the schools became even more schoolish or school-like than before, just like the children became much more childlike or childish than before. They wanted to stress the characteristics of a school, they wanted to stress the characteristics of a child, and then you had that whole processes of infantilizing and infantilization and so on, certainly in the preschool education. We have, in our work, tried to understand these developments, and in fact, these are two books in which we contributed, and even in the second one, they took our idea that what happened in school historically is a black box and so on, to open that black box. Let me now come back to the school desk. What is then the hypothesis? Well, that new material, like the Montessori tableware for preschoolers, did not necessarily have a big impact on the educational behavior of school and preschool teachers. It seems not to have resulted into a Copernican revolution, nor did the inner architecture of the school and the classroom changes. On the contrary, we have, with the most modern or the most progressive, the most new education in Belgium was that of Ovide de Crolly. We have tried, and it is published in Zeitschrift für Pädagogik, auf den Spuren von Diskurs, Traum und Wirklichkeit der architektonischen Formgebung in der de Crollys Ermitage. We have said, and in that article demonstrated that another faith, also in education, may require another temple, but in reality, things remained much more the same. One can even ask, is there historical research on school desks? Well, if you look at the existing literature, what you will find is the idea of disciplining. Discipline, and that has, of course, to do with the idea, well, from the 1990s onwards, history of education was a little bit, or some parts of the history of education, let me put it like that way, have been under the pressure of the Michel Foucault, as you will know, idea of gaze and its biopolitical context. And I think in Germany, the work of Marcelo Caruso was famous on that. And he wanted, for instance, to show that the Bell-Lancaster method in class with that long desks had to be interpreted from more or less that perspective. And there is another book in Germany from Gnilka in 2003, Disziplinierte Körper, die Schulbank als Erziehungsapparat. And the cover is very illustrative. You see a skeleton. But the school desk is, of course, much more than an educational apparatus, and the individual to be educated, I think all pedagogues will agree with me, much more than a skeleton without flesh. So, I will concentrate for the rest of this short lecture on research that we have done, and it goes back to that irony of school reform, to showing you that it is not so simple in history, and that kind of discourses of old education and new education constantly had to be revisited or intermingled, and so on and so on. This is also published in the Zeitschrift für Pädagogik in German, of course, but we did this presentation once in Geneva in the ICHE. And we started our presentation by a remarkable quotation of Walter Benjamin. In his biographical work, Benjamin is writing, "The doctor discovered I was nearsighted and prescribed not only a pair of glasses, but a desk. It was very ingeniously constructed. The seat could be adjusted to move toward or away from the slanted desktop that served as a writing surface. In addition, there was a horizontal bar built into the chair back that provided comfortable support, not to mention a little book rack which crowned the whole and which could slide back and forth. It was not long before the desk at the window had become my favorite spot." And it goes further, "The desk thus bore a certain similarity to my school bench. But it has this advantage. It was safely hidden away there and had room for things my school bench knew nothing about. The desk and I were united against it, and hardly had I regained my desk after a dreary day at school, then it gave me new strength. There I could feel myself not only at home, but actually in my shell. Just like one of those clerics who are shown in medieval paintings kneeling at their prie-dieu or sitting at their writing desk, as though encased in armor. In this burrow of mine, I would begin reading. I sought out the most peaceful time of day and this most secluded of all spots. I would then open my book to page 1, with all the solemnity of an explorer setting foot on a new continent. A beautiful quotation, which is, I think, important for several reasons. First of all, the school desk is interpreted as an instrument of the then dominant repressive discipline in everyday school life. Even a relation is led with its clerical prehistory, which is correct, and there is supporting literature from France to that, but I will not go into detail. But what is revealing here is that the desk also could have positive impact, a place for self-finding and self-development. So this proves once again, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, that educational outcomes are in no way the simple translation of what curriculum builders intended. And of course, images have to be contextualized. Like this image, for instance, it is a historical device, a materiality of mental space, but it can also have positive outcomes. Our research, however, was something still different. We found a very remarkable figure in Brussels, namely Oskar Brodsky. He was born in Odessa, so he came from Ukraine, and was by accident in Brussels when the First World War broke out, and he had to stay there. So he had to find a way out. He came from the Jewish quarter in Odessa, was not unrich, but had to find money in doing something. And he had the idea to make school desks. And of course, for advertising his school desks and his inventions on school desks, he got into the then very popular scientific and semi-scientific discourse of medicalization. He was fighting against so-called school sickness like scoliosis and the like by introducing a brand new made-to-measure desk in view of the purposes of that new education. And one of his findings was the individual foldable school desk. You see advertising here for the individual foldable school desk. There was something that you could take at home, that you could have in you could go to a conference, you had your school desk, you could go to school, you had your own school desk, and so on and so on. That was his idea. He thought he had found a very popular new technique. But this proved to be not a very successful innovation. Hardly any Brodsky desks from this series were sold. So we asked ourselves, why? How come? Had it to do with the designer? Or was it bad publicity, bad discourse? Was there a lack of marketing or production? Or was the failure for the economic success in relation to the object itself? So let's look at these four factors. Certainly, the designer and his discourse, I think this was relatively correct in the sense of economical terms. Brodsky came from a very successful business family. He was able to sell other classical school desks, and I think he had the right discourse at the time, the scientific and, as I said, pseudo or semi-scientific argumentation of the Brussels pedagogical school and pedocentric authorities, to which also De Crolly belonged, and he was fighting against medical diseases like scoliosis, and you can see some pictures of it. And so having a right position and a right school desk would help to avoid that kind of sicknesses. Also, his lobbying was not incorrect. The idea he had with the foldable school desk was the open-air schools, like also in Germany, the Freiluftschulen, which was one of the aspects of the so-called new education. And that was his propaganda. He had also very good pictures and photographs at the time. And I think also the marketing, you see in the Panne at the North Sea in Belgium, a whole school, remarkable by the way, because this is a new school, an open-air school, and what is different of a classroom, it is outside. But the architecture, the inner architecture of the classroom, which proves our thesis of how difficult it is to change that mentality of classroom and classroom ideas, was ordered in the same way as an ordinary classroom inside. But probably, and here you can see this irony, this is a very nice cartoon about l'école en plein air, the open-air schools, because you go outside, but it is the same classroom that continues. But I think that the explanation is very ironical. Probably that was the reason, because these individual foldable school desks, with a weight of more than almost 10 kilos, which could also have played a role, was too modern for the school. Because people at that time, when they were thinking about schools, even in open-air schools, were thinking in traditional terms about schools. And probably because he wanted to have this foldable school desk also in a modern society to be applied, it was too schoolish for modern society. In his propaganda, I found this picture. And in fact, his idea of the school desk was a forerunner of what we have now, a laptop, without ICT. But the idea was that you have your desk, even this policeman on his horse has his laptop, that you can write, that you can take notes everywhere. But I think at that time, that was a little bit also, it was too schoolish. A school desk was something that belonged to a classroom and that not has to be integrated in ordinary life. I hope I have shown to you that history is a magnificent field of study, full of questions, and that we have, that we need a lot of interesting people to tackle these questions in the future. I thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, you always can contact me by email. Thank you very much.